Hello, I'm Stephen, and I just want to share a thought I had about the shortest verse in the Bible. John 11, verse 35. Two words, Jesus wept. Perhaps, though, inside of these two words, it contains absolute just oceans of meaning. And sometimes when you think about somebody weeping, there just seems to be a lot of unfathomable emotions. And so as you look at John 11 verse 35, and where Jesus wept over his friend Lazarus, have you ever found yourself drawn back to this verse again and again? Not because it's easy to understand, but because it's so impossibly difficult. It presents us with a paradox that shatters our neat theological categories. The God-man stands before a tomb and he cries. And so, as you look at just the two verses, the two words here in the verse, just sit with it for a minute and think about just the strangeness of the moment. Jesus knew, he actually knew that Lazarus would walk out of that tomb in a matter of minutes. And yet, we know that he had delayed his journey intentionally. And you see that in John 11, verse 4. It says that, he arrived 4 days later, telling his disciples, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified through it. He knew the ending, and yet he still wept anyways. But what kind of a weeping is this? Do you think it would be a weeping or crying of helplessness? It's not just a grief of someone who's lost all hope. This is not. This is something totally else entirely. This is something that perhaps reveals more about God's character than 1,000 theological textbooks could ever expound upon. And when you think about times when you've cried, how they come, when you feel so powerless, when the world has spun beyond my control, when death seems to have won, yet we see right here, Jesus wept with full knowledge that he was about to reverse death itself. So what kind of tears could these have been? Perhaps they were the tears of entering in. Jesus could have remained detached. He could have approached the scene as a divine technician coming to fix a problem. Instead, he allowed himself to fully be present in the moment of tragedy and in the grief, and in the moment with Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. The crushing weight of what death does to people that we love is seen, I think, in John 11. And so, even the idea of the incarnation of Jesus wasn't just about merely taking on flesh. It's about taking on a full human experience, including the experience of standing at a graveside and feeling the wrongness of it all. When Mary came to Jesus, we read verses like John 11, verse 33, where it says that when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her, the Bible says he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. John 11:33. You see the shuddering of his spirit, the visceral emotion. And when you look at what's happening in the scene in John 11, you may notice something about grief, is that it's not terribly rational. We cry at funerals, even when we believe in the resurrection. We weep over losses, even when we trust in God's sovereignty. And here we see Jesus himself models this for us. Faith and tears are not opposite then. In fact, we see here that hope and heartbreak can occupy the same moment. When John tells us that Jesus wept, he uses a word that suggests not only loud wailing, but also quiet tears. And the same image is present. We still see God crying. Not God orchestrating from a distance. Not God trying to explain the theological necessity of suffering. But God standing with dirt on his feet, tears on his face. This matters because, we live in a world that is so constantly producing new reasons to cry. We bury friends too young. We watch disease ravage bodies. We see evil flourish and innocence crushed. And in those moments, we don't need a God who explains it all away or who reminds us to look on the bright side. We need a God who cries. And so as you look at John 11 here, that says, he wept. The mystery, it seems to me, deepens when we realize that Jesus wept even though he was about to demonstrate his power over death. And so this suggests something rather profound. That God's power is not incompatible with God's compassion. The omnipotence doesn't require emotional distance. That the same Jesus who would command in John 11 verse 43 for Lazarus to come forth could also let tears roll down his own cheeks. Maybe this is why the bystanders, when they saw Jesus, and in John 11 verse 36 it says, "Behold, see how he loved him." They didn't say, "See how powerful he is." They didn't say, "See how well he explains suffering away." They recognize something more fundamental. Love that enters into pain rather than hovering over it. And so I wonder if we've sometimes gotten the order wrong. We think we need to understand suffering first before we can trust God. There's a gap we have to cross. We think we need to have answers first before we can believe. Perhaps what Jesus is offering here is something prior to explanation. We see his presence. We see his tears. We see his willingness to stand with us in the valley of the shadow of death. This doesn't mean that, of course, pain goes away. Lazarus would eventually die again. Mary and Martha would eventually face loss again. We all do. Part of being a human. But for one moment at a tomb in Bethany, the God of the universe showed us that He doesn't ask us to suffer alone. That He doesn't remain unmoved by our tears, but that He walked this painful road Himself. Hebrews 4:15, and you probably know the verse. The writer would say, therefore we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Here at Lazarus' tomb, we see the sympathy in action, not as some abstract theology on display, but as tears on a human face. An interesting quote from a philosopher named Nicholas Wolterstorff, writing about the death of his own son, said that God is not only the God who gives, but also the God who suffers. Here at Lazarus' tomb, we see both. We see Jesus will give back life to his friend, but first He suffers alongside those who grieve. Perhaps this is the mystery, if you will, of the incarnation in a miniature form. You know, that God loved us enough not just to save us from a distance, but to join us in the mess, to feel what we feel and to weep when we weep. You may think about Isaiah 53, verse number 3. Where Isaiah would prophesy centuries before Jesus that He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. When we grieve, when we suffer, when we stand at our own tombs wondering where God is, perhaps He is closer than we think. Not explaining, not philosophizing somewhere, just there weeping with us, sharing our sorrows, bearing our pain. And so therefore comes back around in a full circle effect, two words, Jesus wept. Because in them, you and I find permission for our own tears. You know, we find a God who doesn't demand that we be strong or stoic or full of unshakable faith every moment. But we find someone who understands that even when the resurrection is coming, the grave still hurts. And so this allows us to find ultimately a God worth trusting. Not because He takes away all the pain, but because He enters it fully. He stands with us in it, and He says yes to us, and He says even it is okay to weep. And He says, I am here with you. And that is the last promise that He gave to the church in Matthew 28, verse number 20, where He says, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. We love that Jesus can weep.